Then solve it. Alexander Whitmore said it softly, but the words landed like a glass dropped in a silent church. Every fork stopped above every plate. Every conversation inside the Sterling room froze beneath the amber chandeliers. The private dining room, perched 57 floors above Manhattan, had been built for men like him, men who spoke in numbers so large they stopped sounding human. $750 million sat on that table in leather folders, encrypted tablets, and legal contracts stacked beside untouched stakes. And standing beside it all, holding a silver water pitcher with both hands, was Naomi Carter, a black waitress in a pressed white shirt and black apron, suddenly trapped in the center of a room that had spent the whole night pretending she was invisible. Alexander leaned back in his chair, his tailored navy suit catching the light, his pale blue eyes fixed on her with the calm amusement of a man who had never been embarrassed in public. "If you're so interested in my screen," he said, turning his laptop toward her, "solve it for $10 million. A few men laughed. Not loudly. Rich men rarely laugh loudly when cruelty can be delivered with polish. Their chuckles moved around the table like smoke. Naomi did not move. She could feel the manager behind her go stiff. She could feel Brent Holloway, Whitmore Dynamics CFO, smiling without kindness. She could feel every eye measuring her uniform before her mind. That was the old math of rooms like this. Apron equals silence. Brown skin equals service. A name tag means you are not supposed to have an opinion. Alexander knew the room was watching him, and he enjoyed it. He had built a company worth $18 billion by turning pressure into theater. Tonight was supposed to be his victory lap, the final dinner before Whitmore Dynamics acquired Fairline Credit AI, a lending platform that promised to predict risk faster than any bank in America. Wall Street loved it. The investors loved it. The lawyers loved it. No one at the table cared that the model on Alexander's screen had been flashing the same warning for 23 minutes. No one except Naomi. She had seen it by accident while refilling his glass. A line of code. A risk curve. A column of zip codes that should not have been there. She had looked 1 second too long, and Brent had caught her. "Careful, sweetheart," he had said, loud enough for the table. "Those numbers might bite." That was when Alexander made the challenge. $10 million if she could explain the problem. Immediate termination if she wasted their time. The room waited for her to shrink. Naomi set the pitcher down so gently the ice barely clicked. She looked at the laptop, then at Alexander, and for the first time that night, her voice entered the room. "Your model isn't broken," she said. "Your assumption is." The smile faded from Alexander's face before anyone else understood why. For 3 seconds, nobody breathed the way people breathe when they are comfortable. The Sterling room had lost its rhythm. The soft jazz still played from hidden speakers. The candles still trembled inside crystal holders, and the city still glittered beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, but the table itself had gone still. Alexander Whitmore stared at Naomi Carter as if she had answered in a language he did not believe she was allowed to know. Brent Holloway gave a short laugh, too quick and too thin. "That is a nice line," he said, tapping one finger against his wineglass. "But this is not a poetry night." Naomi kept her hands folded in front of her apron. She had learned long ago that calm made arrogant people nervous. Alexander tilted his head, studying her now, not as a person yet, but as a problem that had failed to behave. "Explain," he said. "One word. Cold. Measured." Naomi looked back at the laptop. The screen showed a risk prediction dashboard for Fairline Credit Artificial Intelligence, the company Alexander was buying before midnight. A blue curve climbed across the graph like a mountain range. Beneath it, rows of data flashed in clean white columns. Income band, loan history, repayment probability, default exposure, location cluster. To the men around the table, it looked like genius. To Naomi, it looked like a locked door with a beautiful handle. "Your model is not failing because it cannot predict risk," she said. "It is failing because it was trained to mistake neighborhood for character." The room tightened. A junior attorney looked down at the table. One of the investors stopped turning his wedding ring. Brent leaned forward. "You have no idea what you are looking at." Naomi did not answer him. She looked at Alexander, because everyone in that room knew where the real power Saturday, that warning in the corner, she said, nodding at the screen, is not a formatting issue. It is a bias drift alert. Your algorithm is overcorrecting based on zip code clusters within 20 miles of major urban centers. It is treating low-income neighborhoods like moral failures instead of financial contexts. The words did not come out loud. They came out clean. That made them worse. Alexander's face remained still, but something behind his eyes shifted. He reached for the trackpad and clicked into the alert history. The same warning appeared again. Then again. 23 minutes of ignored red flags. Brent's smile disappeared piece by piece. That data was normalized, he said. Naomi finally turned to him. No, it was polished. A soft sound moved through the room. Not quite a gasp, not quite a whisper. The difference mattered. Normalized meant repaired. Polished meant hidden. Alexander clicked into the model notes. His jaw flexed once. Naomi saw it. So did everyone else. For the first time all night, the billionaire was not performing power. He was calculating damage. Outside the windows, Manhattan looked endless, bright, expensive, untouchable. Inside, one waitress had just placed a crack through a $750 million mirror, and everyone at that table was starting to see what had been standing behind the glass. Brent Holloway reached for the laptop, as if taking it back could take back the silence. This is proprietary material, he said, his voice polished enough to sound professional and nervous enough to betray him. She should not even be seeing this. Naomi stepped half an inch away from the table, but she did not lower her eyes. That tiny distance mattered. It told the room she was not begging for permission. She was choosing restraint. Behind her, Mr. Ellis, the restaurant manager, cleared his throat in that careful way service workers used when rich men started turning uncomfortable. Miss Carter, he said quietly, perhaps you should return to the floor. Alexander raised one hand without looking at him, and the manager stopped speaking like someone had closed a door. The room belonged to Alexander again, but not completely. Something had changed. Power was still seated at the head of the table, but truth was standing beside the water pitcher. Alexander clicked through another layer of the dashboard. The screen shifted to a map of the East Coast, broken into glowing blocks of color. Green for safe borrowers, yellow for uncertain, red for high risk. Most of the red pulsed around neighborhoods that Naomi recognized without needing street names. South Bronx, Newark, East Baltimore, Southeast Washington. Parts of Philadelphia where row houses leaned close together like tired shoulders. Places where families worked 2 jobs, paid bills late because paychecks arrived later, and still somehow kept showing up. Places where banks had always found a clean way to say no. Naomi felt her chest tighten, but her voice stayed even. Your model is using location as a shortcut for instability, she said. It is calling people risky before it ever looks at their actual behavior. Brent laughed again, but this time nobody joined him. That is an emotional interpretation. Naomi turned to him slowly. No, it is a statistical one. One investor, a woman named Diane Mercer who had not spoken all night, leaned forward. What would you need to verify that? Brent shot her a warning look, but Diane ignored him. Money respects confidence, but it worships doubt when the numbers start bleeding. Naomi glanced at the table. 3 things. Training sample distribution, denial rate by income band, and the exclusion list for variables removed before deployment. The junior attorney went pale. Not terrified. Recognizing. There is a special kind of fear that enters a room when someone says the exact words no outsider should know. Alexander noticed it immediately. He looked from Naomi to the attorney, then back again. How do you know those terms? He asked. Not mocking now. Not smiling. Naomi could have answered with her history. She could have told them about the nights she studied until 2 in the morning after double shifts, about the scholarship that almost happened, about the rejection emails written with soft language and hard consequences. But timing is power too, and Naomi understood timing better than anyone at that table expected. Because math does not become invisible just because I am serving dinner, she said. The words settled over the table with a quiet weight. Brent pushed his chair back. This is absurd. Alexander, we are minutes away from closing. Alexander did not respond. His eyes were locked on the screen now, moving faster, reading deeper. The red clusters flickered under his fingertips. Then he opened the exclusion list. For the first time that night, his face changed completely. Not anger. Not pride. Recognition. Naomi saw the file name reflected in his eyes, and she knew he had found it. The variable had not been removed. It had been renamed. The room did not understand the file name at first. It looked harmless, almost boring, the kind of label designed to disappear inside a spreadsheet. Community Stability Index. But Naomi saw Alexander's fingers stop over the trackpad, and she knew the truth had finally walked into the room wearing a clean suit. Community Stability Index was not a new metric. It was the old zip code variable with a better haircut. The same neighborhood marker. The same quiet door closing on people before they even reached the counter. Alexander clicked once, then again, opening the documentation buried beneath 3 folders and a password prompt. The air around him seemed to thin. Brent leaned forward too quickly. "That is an internal waiting label," he said. "It is standard industry practice." Naomi looked at the glowing red clusters on the screen. Standard does not mean right. Diane Mercer exhaled through her nose, slow and controlled, like a woman watching a bridge crack, while everyone else was still admiring the paint. The junior attorney lowered his eyes. Mr. Ellis remained near the wall, frozen between protecting his employee and protecting the restaurant's richest table of the year. Nobody poured wine now. Nobody touched the food. The steaks cooled under silver lids while $750 million began to sweat. Alexander opened a comparison chart. On one side were applicants from high-income neighborhoods with short credit histories. On the other were applicants from lower-income neighborhoods with longer repayment records. The model favored the first group anyway. Not by a little, by enough to change lives. Naomi did not need to raise her voice. "A person in Tribeca with a thin file gets patience," she said. "A nurse in Newark with 12 years of rent receipts gets labeled unstable." The sentence moved through the room like a match struck in the dark. One of the bankers shifted in his chair. Another looked toward the door as if distance could protect him from implication. Brent adjusted his cuff links, buying seconds. "That is a simplification." Naomi nodded once. "So is discrimination when you put it in a dashboard." Alexander finally looked up. The arrogance had not vanished completely. Men like him did not lose it all at once. It peeled away under pressure. First the smile, then the performance, then the belief that the world would always bend around his explanations. "You said this was an assumption problem," he said. "Which assumption?" Naomi held his gaze. "That poverty is proof of irresponsibility." Silence. Not the empty kind. The full kind. The kind packed with every family that had ever been denied by a system too polished to sound cruel. Alexander looked back at the screen, and something in his posture changed. Less throne. More witness stand. Diane reached for the tablet beside her and began typing notes. The attorney whispered to another lawyer. Brent saw it happening and tried to seize the room back. "Alexander, this conversation is exposing confidential acquisition materials to a restaurant employee." That was when Naomi gave him the smallest smile of the night. Not warm, not cruel, just exact. "No," she said. "It is exposing them to someone who read them correctly." The words cut cleaner than shouting ever could. Alexander said nothing for a long moment. Then he turned the laptop fully toward her, no longer as a joke, no longer as a trap. "Show me," he said. 2 words this time, different from the first. And every person at that table understood that the challenge had changed hands. Naomi did not touch the laptop right away. That was the first thing everyone noticed. She did not rush toward the money. She did not grab the moment like someone starving for applause. She stood still beside the white tablecloth, with her name tag catching the chandelier light, and looked at Alexander Whitmore as if the $10 million had become the least important number in the room. "I will show you," she said, "but I want the room to hear it." Brent made a sharp sound under his breath. "Absolutely not." Diane Mercer looked at him. "Let her speak." 3 simple words, spoken by a woman whose fund controlled more than $2 billion. And suddenly Brent found the edge of his authority. Alexander moved the laptop closer to Naomi. "Go ahead." Naomi leaned in just enough to see the screen clearly. The scent of rosemary butter and expensive cologne hung in the air, strangely useless now. No one cared about dinner. The whole room had become a courtroom without a judge, and the evidence was glowing in blue and red on a 13-inch screen. Naomi clicked into the training sample summary. "Here," she said, "your model claims repayment history carries the most weight. But look at the interaction terms. Community Stability Index is influencing the final score even when repayment behavior is strong." She opened another panel. Lines of numbers appeared. "Now compare applicants with similar income, similar debt, and similar payment records. The only major difference is where they live." She dragged the cursor across the chart. Red blocks widened. Green blocks narrowed. The truth did not shout. It expanded. That is why the warning keeps appearing. The model is not drifting randomly. It is drifting toward geography. The junior attorney swallowed. A banker whispered something into his phone, then stopped when Diane stared at him. Alexander's face hardened, but not at Naomi. At the screen. It is about market conditions. Naomi nodded. Then why rename the zip code field after legal review? The question landed with perfect aim. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just impossible to dodge. Alexander turned slowly toward Brent. Answer her. Brent's mouth opened, but no sentence came out clean. That was the problem with polished men. They practiced confidence, not truth. Naomi clicked into the metadata. A revision note appeared from 6 months earlier. Replaced direct geographic label with stability proxy. Legal flagged optics. Diane read it aloud under her breath, and the room changed temperature. Optics. Not ethics. Not fairness. Not accuracy. Optics. Alexander stared at the note as if it had personally insulted him. For the first time that night, Naomi saw something human move across his face. Not kindness yet. Not regret. But the beginning of shame. She knew that look. She had seen it in people who suddenly realized the floor beneath them was built by someone else's silence. That note was not in the acquisition packet, Alexander said. His voice was low now. Dangerous in the way a closing door is dangerous, not because it is loud, but because it leaves no room to escape. Brent lifted both hands slightly. We were going to address it after closing. Naomi looked at him, then at every investor seated around that table. After closing means after families are denied. After closing means after the damage has a quarterly report. Nobody laughed this time. Nobody even looked away. Outside, yellow taxis moved far below like tiny sparks through the Manhattan streets. Inside, Naomi Carter had done more than solve a technical flaw. She had forced a room full of powerful people to see the people hidden inside their numbers. The word family stayed in the air longer than the numbers. That was the thing Alexander Whitmore had never understood about data. Numbers could be moved, renamed, compressed, polished, and buried under clean charts. People could not. Naomi kept her eyes on the screen, but what she saw was not only the dashboard. She saw a small brick house in Queens with peeling white paint around the windows. She saw her father at the kitchen table with a stack of envelopes beside his coffee mug, rubbing his forehead while trying to understand why a bank had rejected him again after 14 years of steady work. She saw her mother folding laundry in silence, because silence was the only thing left when hope became too expensive. Naomi had been 16 then, old enough to understand rejection, too young to understand how beautifully rejection could be disguised. The letter had said insufficient credit confidence. It had sounded official. It had sounded neutral. It had sounded nothing like a door being shut because of a neighborhood. Years later, when Naomi learned statistics, she finally understood that cruelty did not always wear a cruel face. Sometimes it wore a clean font, a confidence score, and a sentence that began with "We regret to inform you." She blinked once and came back to the room. Brent was still trying to recover. "We are talking about projections," he said. "Not people." Naomi looked at him then, really looked at him, and the softness in her face disappeared. "That is exactly the problem." Diane set her tablet down. Alexander did not move. Naomi pointed to the dashboard again. "This model will not just recommend denials. It will influence interest rates, loan approvals, insurance reviews, and small business credit lines if it is bundled the way your acquisition memo suggests. It does not need to say race. It does not need to say poverty. It only needs to punish the places where certain people have been forced to build their lives." The room went quiet in a different way now. Earlier, the silence had been shock. Now it was understanding, and understanding was heavier. One of the lawyers whispered, "Exposure could be significant." Diane turned to him sharply. "Exposure." Her voice was calm, but it carried steel. "That is the word you choose?" The lawyer stopped speaking. Alexander looked at Naomi. "How far does it reach?" Naomi clicked into the deployment forecast. The answer appeared as a column of projected accounts. Mortgage pre-qualification, auto refinancing, emergency credit, small business lending. "If you close tonight," she said, "within the first year, this system could influence more than 400,000 applications across 12 states." No one touched their glasses. No one adjusted their chairs. Even Brent looked smaller. 400,000 was no longer an investor metric. Naomi straightened. her voice steady enough to carry every word. "Your math is clean," she said. "Your data is dirty." There it was. The sentence the room would remember. Not because it was clever, because it was true. Alexander closed his eyes for half a second, and when he opened them, the billionaire who had mocked her was still there, but something else had entered him too. Not defeat, not yet redemption. Consequence. He turned to Brent, and the temperature around the table dropped. Who approved this rename? Brent swallowed. For the first time all night, the man with all the answers had none ready. Naomi did not smile. This was not victory to her. Victory would have been her father keeping that house. Victory would have been thousands of families never needing a waitress in Manhattan to defend them from a machine they would never see. But the room was listening now. That mattered. Sometimes justice does not arrive as thunder. Sometimes it arrives as one woman in an apron, standing beneath a chandelier, teaching millionaires that a flawed formula can still have perfect handwriting. Brent looked down at his hands, as if the answer might be hiding beneath his cuff links. For most of the night, he had spoken like a man who believed language was a shield, but now every polished phrase seemed too thin to hold. Alexander waited, and the waiting became its own kind of pressure. Around the table, people who had spent careers buying time suddenly understood what it felt like to have none. "The rename came from compliance review," Brent said finally. The concern was presentation. Diane Mercer's eyes narrowed. Presentation to whom? Brent glanced at the lawyers, then at Alexander, then back to the screen. To regulators. To partners. To anyone who might misunderstand the model. Naomi let the words pass through the room before she answered. They would not have misunderstood it. They would have understood it too clearly. That was when the junior attorney, a young man named Miles Porter, closed his eyes like someone hearing the final lock click shut. Alexander saw it. "You know something?" he said. Miles opened his mouth, then stopped. His career was sitting on one side of the table. His conscience was standing beside Naomi on the other. It was amazing how quiet ambition became when truth asked it a direct question. "There was an external complaint," Miles said. Brent snapped his head toward him. "Miles." Alexander's voice cut in, low and sharp. "Let him speak." Miles swallowed. 2 years ago, before Fairline was packaged for acquisition, someone sent a technical memo about geographic proxy bias in the lending model. It was forwarded to risk review, then marked unresolved. The room shifted again, but Naomi did not. She had known this moment was coming the instant she saw the renamed variable. Still, hearing it out loud made something old move inside her chest. Not pain exactly. Recognition. Alexander turned to her slowly. "You knew about this before tonight." Naomi held his gaze. "I wrote that memo." The words did not explode. They landed softly, and somehow that made them stronger. Brent went pale. Diane leaned back in her chair. The manager near the wall looked at Naomi as if he was seeing an entirely different woman standing in the same uniform. Alexander stared at her, and for the first time all night, he seemed unable to arrange his face into command. Naomi reached into the pocket of her apron and took out her phone. Not dramatically, not triumphantly, just carefully, like someone opening a drawer that had been closed for too long. She scrolled, tapped, and turned the screen toward him. There it was. The email. Sent 2 years earlier to Whitmore Dynamics Risk Intake. Subject line: Urgent concern regarding proxy discrimination in automated lending model. Beneath it, her name. Naomi Carter. Attached file. 32 pages. Time stamped at 1:17 in the morning. Alexander read the screen. His jaw tightened. "Why would you send this to my company?" Naomi's voice softened, but it did not weaken. "Because I applied there first." No one spoke. "I had the grades. I had the project work. I had the references. I made it through 2 interviews. Then I was told I was not the right cultural fit." She looked at Brent then, and something in his face told the room exactly who had signed off on that language. "So I sent the memo anyway. I thought maybe the work would matter even if I did not." Alexander looked from Naomi to Brent, and the silence turned cold. Outside the windows, Manhattan kept shining like nothing had changed. But inside the Sterling room, a waitress had just become the witness, the expert, and the warning they had ignored. Alexander did not look at Brent first. He looked at the email. That was worse. A man like Alexander Whitmore could argue with a person, challenge a room, bend a negotiation, freeze an employee with one sentence. But he could not intimidate a timestamp. The screen said 1:17 in the morning. It said Naomi Carter had warned them before the acquisition, before the dinner, before the investors, before the champagne, before he turned her into entertainment. It said the truth had knocked on his door 2 years ago, and someone inside his empire had left it standing outside. Diane Mercer reached across the table. "May I see that?" Naomi handed her the phone. Diane read in silence, and with each second, the room seemed to lose another layer of luxury. The crystal glasses looked smaller. The silverware looked colder. The city lights beyond the windows no longer felt like success. They felt like witnesses. "This is detailed," Diane said. "This is not a complaint. This is a full risk analysis." Miles Porter nodded carefully. "It was one of the strongest external submissions we received that quarter." Brent turned on him. "You are overstating it." Miles looked down, then back up, and something in his face changed. Maybe courage does not always arrive roaring. Sometimes it arrives tired. Sometimes it arrives 2 years late, but it still arrives. "No," Miles said. "I am done understating it." The words struck Brent harder than anger would have. Alexander finally turned toward his chief financial officer. "You rejected her application." Brent adjusted his collar. "Human resources handled that. You signed the final note." Alexander's voice was quiet, almost flat, which made every person at the table listen harder. Brent's eyes flicked toward the phone in Diane's hand, then toward Naomi. She lacked institutional experience. Naomi gave a small nod, as if she had expected that answer and buried it long ago. "I lacked access," she said. "Not ability." That sentence did what no spreadsheet could do. It made the room personal. It pulled the polished language off the wall and showed the brick underneath. Alexander looked at Naomi then, really looked at her, beyond the apron, beyond the tray, beyond the part of his mind that had sorted people by title before he sorted them by truth. She was standing in a room full of people who had dismissed her twice, once as an applicant and once as a waitress, and somehow she was still the calmest person there. That kind of dignity cannot be taught in business school. It is built in kitchens, on buses, beside hospital bills, under late-night lamps, in places where nobody claps for survival. Diane placed Naomi's phone on the table gently. "I am pausing my fund's participation until there is an independent audit." One banker immediately sat forward. "Diane, that could jeopardize the closing." She did not blink. "Good." The word was clean. "Final." Another investor, a silver-haired man who had barely spoken all night, cleared his throat. "My firm will also pause." Then another. Then the attorney. One by one, the deal began to step away from Alexander's control. Not collapse. Not yet. But step away. That was worse for a man who measured life by command. Alexander watched it happen in silence. Brent whispered, "This is a mistake." Alexander looked at him with eyes that had lost their shine. "No," he said. "The mistake was thinking nobody outside this table could see what we hit on it." Naomi felt the words pass through her, but she did not let them soften her too quickly. Apologies from powerful men were easy when money was at risk. The harder question was what they did when the cameras were gone, when the contracts changed, when the people harmed by a model still needed someone to answer. Alexander closed the laptop halfway, then stopped. He looked at Naomi again. "Miss Carter," he said, and for the first time that night, he used her name like it had weight. "I owe you an apology." The entire table waited. Naomi did not. She simply answered, "You owe one to more people than me." Alexander Whitmore did not answer right away, because there are moments when a man finally hears the size of his own silence. He looked around the table at the investors, the lawyers, the bankers, the untouched plates, the laptop half closed like a confession that had almost been hidden again. Then he looked back at Naomi Carter. Not at her apron, not at her name tag. At her. "You are right," he said. The words were quiet, but they reached every corner of the Sterling room. Brent lowered his eyes. Diane Mercer folded her hands and waited, because an apology without action was just another expensive performance. Alexander seemed to understand that too. He opened the laptop again, turned it toward the room, and pushed it to the center of the table. "The closing is suspended," he said. A banker started to object, but Alexander lifted one hand. This time, the gesture did not feel arrogant. It felt final. Effective immediately, Whitmore Dynamics will commission an independent audit of the Fairline model, all related training data, all proxy variables, and every denial pathway touched by this system. He paused, and the pause mattered. If harm was done, We will not hide behind technical language. We will notify the affected institutions. We will cooperate with regulators. And we will fund a review process for applicants who were unfairly flagged. The room sat with that. Not celebration. Not relief. Accountability rarely enters a room like music. It enters like a bill that has finally come due. Naomi watched him carefully. She had seen powerful people make promises when shame was fresh and witnesses were near. She had also seen promises fade by morning. "And hiring?" she asked. Alexander looked at her, and this time there was no performance left. "We will reopen the positions connected to risk ethics and model review. External applicants will be evaluated by blind technical assessment first. Names, schools, addresses, photographs, and referral status removed." Naomi nodded once, but she did not smile. Good. It was one word, but it held years inside it. Years of being underestimated, redirected, rejected politely, spoken over, looked through, and told in soft corporate language that the door was not for her. Alexander pushed his chair back and stood. Slowly, respectfully, the room followed him with their eyes. "Miss Carter," he said, "I cannot undo what happened to your family. I cannot undo the email my company ignored. I cannot undo the way I treated you tonight." His voice caught slightly, not enough to become spectacle, just enough to become human. "But I can stop pretending I did not benefit from a system that made it easier not to see you." Naomi felt the words touch something old, but she kept her spine straight. Forgiveness was not a tip to be left on the table. It was not owed because a rich man finally felt embarrassed. She picked up the silver water pitcher, the same one she had been holding when they laughed at her, and set it beside his empty glass. "Then start seeing the people your numbers affect," she said. Alexander nodded, and this time he looked smaller in the right way. Not ruined. Reduced to human size. Diane stood next. "Naomi, I want your memo in the audit file by morning, with your permission." Naomi looked at her phone, then at the table that had once seemed so far above her. "You can have the memo," she said. "But the people in it need more than permission. They need repair." Outside, Manhattan kept moving, taxis flashing yellow below, office towers glowing like frozen stars. Inside, the richest table in the room had gone quiet for a waitress who had never needed their permission to be brilliant. He had challenged her with millions. She answered with truth. And by the time the candles burned low, everyone understood the money had never been the miracle. She was